Hello and welcome to History Time. On the eve of the release of Valiant, the Symphony by Isaignani Ilayaraja, let us take a look at some of the prominent episodes connected with Western classical music in the history of our city, Madras, that is Chennai. After all, Isaignani's career was made in this city, and it was from here that he journeyed to world fame. And so this may be the appropriate location to trace its association with this wonderful art form. Come, join me on this journey. Western classical music certainly came to this city with the Colonials, and perhaps it acquired its base here with the tenure of the English. They came here in 1639, and thereafter we find no mention of Western classical music or instruments or books for quite some time. It's only from the 1750s onwards that we find, with increasing stability and greater extent of the empire, that the Colonials had time to focus on the finer aspects of life. We then begin to read in trickles and starts about the import of musical instruments, how some of them were learning to play here and how they found it very difficult, how instruments were all falling to pieces given the weather and all that sort of thing. But by 1794, we know that things had settled down somewhat, because by then the Church of St. Mary's had a brand new organ. It had had a long history of organs even prior to 1794, and we know that in 1749 the French stole the organ from here and went and installed it in their church in Pondicherry. And finally, when the British went and bombarded Pondicherry, they brought back the organ to Madras. But by the time the Church of St. Mary's had another organ in it, and therefore this was handed over to some other church, and so on. But in 1794, a brand new organ was in place in the Church of St. Mary's, and the city had perhaps its first performance, a concert of sacred music. On the organ itself was Michael Topping, who would later make a name for himself as the first astronomer of the East India Company in Madras city. And he would also help in establishing the first modern observatory of India on Nungambakam High Road. Michael Topping in this concert was accompanied by Lady Oakley, the wife of the then governor, Sir Charles Oakley. Thereafter, we find references to pianos, to violins. We know that the governor's orchestra had come into existence, the corporation had a band, and they all used to play and perform on special occasions and during weekends by the beach. And so there was a demand for musical instruments, for teaching music and learning music. In 1842, we know that the landmark music shop, India's oldest surviving outlet for Western classical music and musical instruments, Misquith and Company, which is today known as Musée Musicals, had come into existence. It still functions from Mount Road. And there it was that in 1901 that it established a connection with the Trinity College of London for conducting examinations, and it continues to do so even today. Certainly that is a great record. The British then began constructing theatres, first for their army, then for their officials, and then for the civilian British population. We had the Pantheon in Egmore, still commemorated by way of a road name, Pantheon Road, and that premises today houses the Government Museum. But we do know that several classical music performances happened in the Pantheon itself. Thereafter, in the 1890s, in the same premises came up the Museum Theatre, and the Museum Theatre was home to the Madras Music Association, which still functions from Musée Musicals even today. Founded in 1893, it is arguably India's oldest musical association dedicated to Western classical music. From the early 1900s, there was a democratization of sorts when it came to Western classical music. Gramophone records began to be available by the hundreds and then the thousands. Western classical music came to be played not just in the homes of the British, but in the houses of Indians as well. People loved to listen, and gradually names such as Bach, Beethoven, Mozart and others came to be common coin in Madras city. Prior to this, Mozart was here even earlier. And how did that happen? We have had a long tradition of Freemasonry in this city. The first establishment of Freemasonry goes back to the 1600s itself, and certainly the Lodge of Perfect Unanimity, which is South India's oldest Masonic lodge, had come into existence in the 1700s. Masonic rituals required Masonic music, and Mozart, being a Freemason himself, had written several pieces for Masonry, and therefore the Freemasonic movement became a home for Western classical music in this city. Even today, the Masonic temple in Egmore, which completes 100 this year, has several sheets of old classical music in its collection, though I am not sure how much of it is really performed in reality. Gramophone records, as I said, made Western classical music very popular, and the reverse was also true. Indian classical music was now being heard in Europe because South Indian artists were being recorded and their discs were being pressed and were being sold all over the world. In France, early in the 1900s, Maurice Delage, who was a visually challenged composer, heard the gramophone record of Coimbatore Thai, and he was so thrilled by her voice production that he determined that one day he would visit India and meet Coimbatore Thai in person. His parents were running a boot polish factory and had a chain of locations all over the world, and embarked on a tour, and Maurice Delage came with them. He came to Madras, found out where Thai lived on Natupillayar Kovil Street, Georgetown, and the two of them had a memorable meeting. Thai perhaps sang for him, because he says that when she sang, it sent chills of delight down his spine. And later, Delage would compose Quatre Poèmes the Hindus, a set of 4 pieces of music dedicated to 4 cities of India: Lahore, Varanasi, Jaipur and Madras. The Madras portion was dedicated to Coimbatore Thai. So here we had an instance of an exponent of South Indian classical music inspiring a composer of Western classical music. You can still hear the Madras section of Quatre Poèmes the Hindus on YouTube if you so feel like. Early in the 1930s, sound came to Tamil cinema, and thereafter music became very important to it. Even earlier, music had been an integral part of Tamil theatre, and it had used musical instruments such as the harmonium and the pedal harmonium. But cinema was completely different. It required orchestration not only for the songs but also for several mood settings, and therefore the demand rose for musicians who could handle orchestra and multiple musical instruments. This was where the Anglo-Indian community of Madras came into its own. Many of them found employment in the cinema industry as well as in theatres and in hotels where music was being performed. And while we often credit the great music to music directors of that period, we forget that there was a great orchestra that worked behind them. There were several recording labels in this city. HMV was one, Pure and Sons was the other, Columbia was a third, Saraswati Stores of AVM was a fourth, there was the Broadcast label. Several labels existed here, and all of them maintained orchestras. And with cinema growing, Western classical music came into its own there as well. There was collaboration between Indian classical music and Western classical music in several ways, and that gives rise to the new genre that we consider as Indian cinema music, which requires several episodes by itself. But let's pause that history over there and get back to the story of Western classical music in the city. Quatre Poème The Hindus was created by Maurice Delage. Then we had to wait for a while. In 1956, Dr. Henry Cowell and his wife, both of them accomplished in Western classical music, came to Madras to attend the December music season of the Music Academy. Having attended it, Dr. Henry Cowell went back and created in 1958 the Madras Symphony, which is dedicated to this city. In March 1959, the Madras Symphony had its debut in this city at the Music Academy, performed by the Little Theatre Orchestra of New York. On that occasion, Dr. Henry Cowell gave the original score sheet of the Madras Symphony to the Music Academy. And then 2 years later, in 1960, we had another composer, Alan Hochwanes, who came along with his wife to attend the December music season of 1959, and on 3rd January he presented the Madras Sonata at the Music Academy. Both the Madras Symphony and the Madras Sonata are available for hearing on YouTube. And therefore, this is a city that has not had a small or a short association with Western classical music. It still continues to flourish. And this week, when Isaignani Ilayaraja releases his symphony, it will only go to re-establish the powerful connection that Madras has had with Western classical music. It is no wonder that this city is one of just 3 cities of India to be recognized as a creative city by UNESCO for its contribution to music. Music lives in this city that we call Madras and Chennai. If you like this episode, share it with your friends, like it, and subscribe to this channel. I promise to be back with you in the following weeks with further episodes from the history of Madras, that is Chennai. Bye for now.